My name is Madelyn Ledoux, and today I will be analyzing 15 companies across 3 different industries to determine which company is the best. First, we will look at the automotive industry. According to Ernst & Young, there are several trends which are shaping the automotive industry. Governments are pushing for safer, cleaner transportation. OEMs are developing new value propositions to meet shifting mobility needs. New players are entering the market due to advances in technology and unmet consumer needs. New risks are arising from globalization. First, we will look at the liquidity ratios. We like to see a current ratio of at least 1. From this slide, we can see that Ford is up and down with their current ratio. Toyota is relatively stable and has enough current assets to cover its current liabilities. Chrysler's current ratio is steadily decreasing, which is not a good thing, and it falls below 1. General Motors experiences the same problem, where they start out with a good current ratio and then it also drops below 1. Now we're going to look at the return on the investment. Ford has a very high ROE. While this seems like a good thing, different things drive the return on equity ratio, so we have to look at what is causing Ford to get such high numbers. Most of the high number of the ROE for Ford comes from the equity multiplier, which is debt. Toyota has a steadily increasing return on equity. It also has the largest profit margin. Toyota's equity multiplier is still relatively small. Chrysler, it has a rather small number for its return on assets, and the ROE right here that it does have is mostly funded by the equity multiplier. Honda's return on equity kind of goes in a hill shape because it starts at 4.78, then it rises at its highest to 10.99, and it goes all the way back down to 4.97. This means that it's on a current downward trend, so we don't really like to see that. And then General Motors does the exact opposite, where it's kind of like a smiley face. It starts out high, then gets low, then gets high again. So its numbers are kind of all over the place. Lastly, we will look at the price to earnings ratio and the market to book ratio. For the automotive industry, everybody's market to book ratio is about the same. The price to earnings ratio is not consistent for any of the industries. Toyota does have the highest price to earnings ratio, and I'm not very worried about the inconsistency because it seems to be the industry norm. Next, we're going to look at the economic value for each of the companies. Ford has a negative economic value, as does Toyota, although Toyota's negative economic value is less negative than Ford's. Chrysler has positive economic value, and this is actually the only automotive company that has positive economic value added this year. Honda, we can see negative, and General Motors is very negative. So, which companies do we like? Toyota. Toyota had, since it had the highest ROE, that was not funded by debt, and since its numbers were consistent and they were all good, Toyota was the choice for the automotive industry. Next, we will look at the pharmaceutical industry. According to PricewaterhouseCoopers, the pharmaceutical companies are experiencing the following industry trends. First, healthcare policymakers and payers are increasingly mandating what doctors can prescribe. Second, instances of chronic disease are increasing. Boundaries between different forms of healthcare are blurring. Demand for medicines is growing more rapidly in the emerging economies. Governments are beginning to focus on prevention rather than treatment. Regulators are becoming more cautious about approving truly innovative medicine. First, we will look at the liquidity ratios. Everybody's current ratio is greater than 1. The only instance of a current ratio being less than 1 is Novartis in 2015, which has a 0.96. So the ratios are all pretty similar. However, there are 2 things to point out. First, Pfizer and Gilead both have a lot of cash sitting around doing nothing. Second, Novartis keeps a lot of inventory, which is shown by a large difference between the current and quick ratio, and that goes to show that Novartis is probably spending more than they should in storage costs. Now looking at the return on equity, return on assets, and profit margins. AstraZeneca has a smiley-faced return on equity trend, so it starts high, drops low, and goes back high. Pfizer had some ups and downs, but the last 3 years have been pretty consistent. Merck is a hill, so it starts out low, then goes high, then goes back down. So it's a trending down, which we don't like. For Novartis, they were pretty consistent until 2016 when they experienced a steep drop. Gilead is very high with extremely high return on equity and extremely high return on assets. If you look at the profit margins kind of follow the same trend as return on equity. So we see that Gilead has a very high return on equity, especially compared to the other companies. So let's go look and see what is driving that. Equity multiplier. It turns out that all 5 companies have very similar equity multipliers. Novartis uses a little bit less debt than the other companies, but Gilead has about the same equity multiplier as AstraZeneca, Pfizer, and Merck, which means that their really high ROE is not driven by debt. They also have a very high times interest earned ratio, and their total asset turnover is consistent with the rest of the companies in the industry. Pfizer has the lowest total asset turnover, but their industry or their company is not doing very well in the industry anyway, so I'm not very concerned about them. Now let's look at the market value ratios. AstraZeneca is kind of all over the place. They have a PE ratio as low as 9.5 and as high as 72, and that's over a span of 3 years, so that's kind of crazy. Pfizer is pretty consistent. Merck and Novartis are all over the place. They have their ups and downs, and Gilead is too. So what I'm seeing here is that most of their price to earnings ratios are all over the place, except for Pfizer, which seems consistent. And the consistent ratios that Pfizer has are against the industry norm. Now looking at economic value added, we see AstraZeneca is about 1,800, Pfizer's about 3,600, Merck has negative economic value added, that's not a good sign. Novartis has a crazy amount of negative economic value added, not a good sign. And Gilead has a very high economic value added, about 5,000 higher than the next highest company. So I choose Gilead for my favorite pharmaceutical company, and that is the pharmaceutical company that is going to go into the running for who to invest in. The third industry that we chose is the virtual technology industry. So right here we have various trends affecting the technology industry companies according to CompTIA. First is the emergence of the cloud era. Second, security is becoming worse, but it is forecasted to improve. Third, data teams bridge the gap between industrial technology and business operations. Fourth, there is a change from the sale of products to the selling of products and services together. Fifth, competition is increasing as new products are developed and more companies are entering the market. And sixth, blended and diverse workforces are using more technology to communicate and conduct business. So first, let's look at liquidity ratios. We see that everybody has a current ratio above 1. This is good because they all have enough current assets to cover their current liabilities. Alphabet has the highest current ratio, being in the 4s and above, and they also have a high cash ratio. Now, generally having a lot of cash sitting around is not great, but in the case of Alphabet, it seems like they most probably use this cash for research and development costs, and that may be why they have such a high cash ratio. Everybody's ratios are above 1. The only time a ratio is not above 1 is some of the cash ratios for AMD and some of GoPro's ratios. Also, HTC cash ratios are less than 1. So We notice that all of the ratios in this industry are pretty consistent except for GoPro, which is kind of up and down. Now let's look at the profitability ratios. If you look at return on equity, we can quickly rule out AMD from all of the companies because they have some negative numbers. It is never really good to get a negative return on equity. We see that HTC and GoPro also have negative return on equity, and we don't have many statistics on GoPro or AMD. So those three companies I'm going to flag as problem companies. Microsoft has a relatively high return on equity, as does Alphabet. So let's see what drives that. If we look at the equity multiplier, which is the amount of debt that the company has, we see that Microsoft and Alphabet have about the same amount of debt for all 5 years. However, going back to return on equity, Microsoft has a much higher return on equity than Alphabet. If we look at total asset turnover, we see that for Microsoft and Alphabet, they're about the same. However, looking at the times interest earned ratio for Alphabet, we see that it is much, much higher than Microsoft's times interest earned. The times interest earned ratio says how many times over interest is covered. So we like to see a high times interest earned ratio. One thing to consider with the return on equity is that while Microsoft certainly does have a much higher return on equity than Alphabet, they're also much less consistent with that return. So their numbers are kind of all over the place, whereas Alphabet, you pretty much know what it's going to be next year. Going back to the slide with the times interest earned ratio and the total asset turnover ratio, we can see that for Microsoft, their times interest earned ratio is trending downwards. It starts at 92, and by 2016, it's at 23. Alphabet, however, starts at 151, and in 2016, they're at 191. As far as their total asset turnovers go, Microsoft's total asset turnover ratio is decreasing, while Alphabet seems to be going, it starts at 60, then it goes down to 55 and up to 57. So it's pretty consistent, and it's not really increasing or decreasing. Next, let's look at the virtual technology market value. I'm not even going to get into AMD and HTC and GoPro because their terrible ROEs just put them out of the running for this. We can see that both Alphabet and Microsoft have similar market to book ratios, but Alphabet has a higher price to earnings ratio. Microsoft's price to earnings ratio is trending upwards. Looking at economic value added, AMD's is negative. Microsoft has 3,300 in millions of economic value added, which is pretty good. HTC is greatly negative. That's terrible. Alphabet has about 3,100 in millions of economic value added. That's pretty good. GoPro is negative. So if a company has negative economic value added, it means that they're making less than they should make on the money that they have. So you never want to see negative economic value added. And since the only two companies with positive economic value added are Microsoft and Alphabet, we like those companies the best. These are our virtual technology company favorites. Choosing one of them, I'm going to go with Alphabet because Alphabet has more consistency in the numbers, and for my investment strategy, I'm going to choose to go with consistently good. Now for the decision. We have to choose between Alphabet, Gilead, and Toyota. I'm going to rule out Toyota because the automotive industry is not a very stable industry just based on all the data from all the companies. And Toyota's numbers and ratios compared to Alphabet's and Gilead's just aren't as good. I'm going to rule out Gilead. It looked like a very safe bet as far as investments go and would be a good company to invest in, but Alphabet's numbers were just so much better than both Gilead's and Toyota's that I'm going to choose Alphabet. It's ahead of the rest. Thank you for listening.